Question. But a global flood would not be compatible with the freshwater creatures. An objection I've heard.
Okay, so again, be wary of the present is the key to the past philosophy. We look at fish in their present state today, where we have clear boundaries between freshwater and saltwater fish. The saltwater is very salty, and you only have saltwater fish in it. The freshwater is very fresh, and you only have freshwater fish in that as well. And so, to ask the question, how would freshwater creatures survive in the saltwater of the flood, you are still applying that present is the key to the past scenario. Couple of things. Number one, remember when God created everything, everything was very good. And so you have an indication of no such thing, or certainly a lower quantity of things like erosion and so on and so forth, which is what ultimately produces salt in the sea. In other words, if you throw a global flood in the mix, one thing it's going to do is actually increase the salinity of the ocean. Now, we do have examples of fish which are able to survive both in saltwater and freshwater. Salmon is a classic example of that, right? So we know that there is possible for some fish to be able to survive under both of those conditions. Now, you also have the background of from a sort of an aquarium perspective, where I know I've been and worked with aquariums, where if you, in some species of fish, in some groups of fish, you can slowly increase the salinity and slowly decrease the salinity of freshwater or saltwater fish until you get a sort of a brackish kind of water where you can have fish that actually exist together. So what it suggests is you've actually had fish that have adapted due to a change in climate to the point where you now have a severity of difference between saltwater and freshwater fish, because you have these distinguishable areas. Saltwater is now very salty and only has saltwater fish. Freshwater is very fresh and only has freshwater fish. In the beginning, when everything was very good, not only would you not have had as salty a water, and so a good chance that you'd have been able to have fish completely thrive in both, but your flood is also going to produce areas of freshwater even within the global flood scenario. You can go to caves today, underwater caves, where you've got heavy salt water at the bottom, clear freshwater at the top, and they do stay separated. So you can have freshwater fish that have come down into the freshwater system and saltwater fish which have come underneath from the sea, and they're in the same cave together because you've actually got this separation factor. So all of these things coming together into answering this objection. Any comments from you or Craig?
We spent a little time in the Chafla Basin, right? Freshwater.
We did.
What did we ask Randy?
Do you get sharks? Yeah.
And he says, yes, we get sharks. They migrate up here. Crabs,
Into the
many
swamps.
others into the swamps. You know, you're talking 100 miles from the coast or near about. It's yes, it can go on today.
Any comments?
And the ocean's getting saltier all the time.
Yes. Do we have a question on the Ask site?
Yes, we do have a question on the Ask site about that, and we also have a couple of items in the fact file if people want to look up fish and salt water and fresh water. And there are fish today that live in mixed environments. You think of river estuaries and tidal rivers where the amount of salt in the environment does change, and fish are able to cope with that. It's all a matter of which way you have little chemical pumps on the surface of the cells in their gills, which can either pump salt out or pump it in, depending on keeping the environment within the fish's body. So the gills are well designed in some fish for actually coping with changes in the salt content. And as Joseph mentioned, there are fish who throughout their life cycle change from one environment to the other. And of course, the classic example is salmon and other fish that start out their life in rivers, migrate to the sea, and then migrate back again. And so they have a built-in system for actually changing the way they keep their salt balance. So it is there, and it's quite possible that many fish have actually lost that as part of the general degradation of the environment. So they are now trapped in whichever environment fits with where their sodium pumps are, where their salt pumps are. trapped in the salt water or the fresh water. But there are fish that can cope with changing environments these days. So there's no reason why there wouldn't have been before Noah's flood and during Noah's flood.
I believe eels are another example as well of fish that can go from one kind of water to another as well. But sorry, yes, Craig and John.
Speaking as the fisherman of the team, there are quite a few methods apart from one Diane talked about. When you have a look at catfish and things like that, that sort of are very used to going from clean water to mucky water to dirty water to salt water, etc., they actually change the constitution of a slime which is on the outside. So when they really don't like the water they're in, they actually are the gluiest fish you could actually get. They're just covered in glue. But it's actually a saltwater iron protection mechanism, which is different from the one that the fish use on their gills. So they have a gluey system that makes it harder for the salt to penetrate. There's also sharks. Having caught sharks for many years, they don't use the gill trick. They don't use the gooey trick. They actually put urine into their blood. And so hence the rule, you want to eat a shark, bleed it as soon as you catch it. Otherwise, it tastes like pee. It really does. It's terrible flavour if you forget to do that. So there's all these mechanisms which are designed to actually enable fish to go from saltwater to freshwater. And we have sharks that swim 20, 30 kilometres upstream into fresh water every day. No trouble.
Good stuff. Yeah, I know my wife can testify to the shark urine taste, having tasted shark in Iceland, and I just wish I'd had a camera on her at the time. But did you have any comments, Craig, before we move on?
I think it's been done pretty well. Our fish farm that we run with the seahorses is in an estuary, and from time to time we have major floods that come down the estuary. Our river here drains about 18% of Tasmania. So when there's floods, we cop it. And there's no doubt that the sudden freshwater flush can cause the creatures some grief if we don't watch it. The sudden change is more of a problem than anything. But we do sometimes, as required, put some of our saltwater fish directly into fresh water for a short period to treat things like parasites. They don't immediately curl up and die or anything like that. You don't leave them in there for too long, but you can actually treat them for various pests and diseases, particularly on the skin, using fresh water. But our estuary does drop to half the normal salt levels of the ocean. So if ocean's about 34 parts per thousand, it drops down to sometimes 16, 17 parts per thousand, and the fish still live happily. Well, I don't know about happily, but they still live out there in the estuary, and people still come fishing, in fact.